Okay, so welcome back to our second online learning session. If you're looking for session 1, 3 or 4, you're in the wrong place. Today we're going to be looking at the story of the Old Testament. And to understand some of the key aspects of the Old Testament, it's important to have a knowledge of how it's structured. Now, for our purposes, we're going to be looking at the canon of the Christian Bible, since that's the context that we'll be using it in. And the key distinction here is that the original order of the Hebrew Bible points to the Israelites' return from exile, whereas the Christian Old Testament points thematically to the arrival of the Messiah. And that's an emphasis of theology, and it's good to just keep that in mind as you're reading the texts. So, the story. Although it's possible to devise a basic structure for the story of the Old Testament, it's important to bear in mind that there are sort of internal variations to the story. Some of the accounts are in direct conflict with one another. Some of the accounts present stories in different ways, and some even omit details where others add details. Now, we're going to be looking at some of the theories behind the sources of the authors later on in the module, but for now, it's enough to say that these stories were told and retold across generations and in and under a variety of circumstances. So don't be surprised to find that the story's not quite smooth. In fact, it's to be kind of expected of a collection like this, which was compiled over such a long time. They didn't sit and write the whole thing in one go, and it's been pieced together from a whole variety of different sources. But I am going to give you a sort of outline of the story, so if you're taking notes, this would be the time to get your pen ready. Now, the story begins with the creation of the world, as all ancient religious collections do. And the double account that we find in the Old Testament tells us a lot about the identity of the ancient Israelites, and we'll see a bit more of that later in the module. And the ancient history takes us through the story of a global flood to the establishment of a specific man, Abraham, as the father of the chosen nations. The Israelites fall into a long period of enslavement in Egypt, out of which Yahweh, their God, brings them, leading them to the Promised Land. And this land is then taken through a series of sort of very violent conquests. A monarchy is established in the Kingdom of Israel, with the legendary figures of David and Solomon at the fore of this kind of time in their history. A division happens within Israel. The kingdom is split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Israel is destroyed by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. The first iteration of Deuteronomy is written under King Josiah at the re-establishment of the Jerusalem cult in around 621 BCE. Now, in 597 BCE, the Babylonians capture Jerusalem and the king and the nobles are sent to Babylon. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem's destroyed and the Babylonian exile begins. And that lasts until around 539 BCE, when Cyrus of Persia successfully conquers Babylon and allows the captured Jews to return to their own land. In 515 BCE, the Jerusalem temple is rebuilt. And between the rebuilding of the temple and its destruction in 70 CE, Israel endures being conquered in Judea by Alexander the Great. They're controlled by the Ptolemies of Egypt. They're conquered in Jerusalem by the Seleucids of Syria, and then by the Roman Empire, as we well know. They instigate several revolts that result in the death of many Jews until the temple is destroyed and replaced with a temple to Jupiter Capitolonus. Now, bearing in mind when a piece of writing was composed and where it fits into that story helps to make sense of the theology, ritual, and tone that it's kind of built around. The variations are often explained by the distance looking back and the picture that the authors were trying to paint. And we'll be returning to that idea later in the module. But for now, I hope that's been a useful overview of the general story. Have a look at the reading and try and unpick a little bit more about the kind of broader picture of the Old Testament. I'll see you in the next session.